But we're going to start off with a conversation by Danielle Barrs, who's the director of EisnerAmper. Danielle Barrs is the director of ESG and sustainability solutions in the firm with over 10 years of experience in environmental management, sustainable business, corporate social responsibility, and environmental social governance, ESG, why we're here today. She works for privately held and publicly traded organizations in a variety of industries, including manufacturing and distribution, real estate, private equity funds, and portfolio managers. Danielle has experience serving Fortune 500 companies, NGOs, and governmental organizations. Prior to joining the firm, Danielle was head of global energy and GHG strategy for a Fortune 200 manufacturing company and has managed all related energy initiatives for 100 plus facilities in over 30 countries worldwide. So Danielle, welcome here today.
Well, thank you for letting me be your keynote, even though I'm sure for some of you, your morning coffee is not quite hit yet. So I will try to do my best to not make that worse for you. And I'm going to do that by starting out with a poll. I know that probably does make it worse. So we're on the honor system here. Promise no judgment. The camera's on me, not you. So I don't think anyone will know your answer. So, honor code. In this room, raise your hand if, and I specifically did not change the slide yet, if I asked you right now what ESG stood for, could you tell me what all three of those words were? Raise your hand if you can. Okay, keep your hands up. Who could say the same thing a year ago? Okay, 2 years ago. All right, 5 years ago. What do you do?
I'm the director of sustainability for Sabre.
Yeah, all right. I like it. So what does that tell you? Basically that ESG is not a new concept, right? So most of you in the room already know this, great. So what in the world happened? First of all, I love that Ray said that ESG is a no-brainer because when I got my first degree, which was from Arizona State in sustainability, I had to explain what my degree was. No one talked about ESG, no one barely talked about sustainability, and if I walked into a boardroom and said, save the polar bears, I would be laughed out of there immediately. I'm already trying to get a seat at the table. Imagine if I started talking about polar bears and pandas 12 years ago, and now we're doing all of these things. We have our own metrics, investors care, companies care, and they're being held accountable. I'm happy about that. I don't know about you. So we know all of these things. My background, as Ray mentioned, really is in sustainability before it was in ESG. And I'm going to get into a little bit what the difference is to me, but it's important because what these are essentially are a series of risk management tool metrics. You can call these KPIs, you can call them topics, but really these are the kinds of things that companies should be looking at. And they're also things that are happening in the world that whether or not companies do want to look at them, they're happening, and they're happening to companies, they're having an effect on companies, and it's not just about voluntary reporting anymore. It's not just about walking into a boardroom and saying, please care about this. Like Ray said, it's a no-brainer, and I'm happy about that. So what's the difference? Now this is important because we're calling it ESG, but there's a whole slew of terms around this. 12 years ago when I started out, there was a little, some 3 words called people, planet, profit. We used to call it the triple bottom line. Some people called it CSR, corporate social responsibility. Some people called it sustainability. Some people called it environmental management because they didn't want to spend 3 minutes explaining 2 degrees. So environmental management, people pretty much know what that means. Now, and I really want to draw the attention to double materiality. So in the US, we don't hear about it as much, but in Europe, it's all over the place. Why? We call it 2 sides of the same coin. And this is important because you cannot decouple the idea that ESG is both happening to companies and companies are being involved in ESG and it affects the surrounding environment, our communities, and how we govern our companies and organizations. So I love this little graphic. It's a great way of looking at it. So the two sides of the same coin, first we have financial materiality and then you have impact materiality. So the way that I like to look at financial materiality, sometimes people use this synonymously with ESG, just a really, really nice high-level way of thinking about it, of some of the terminology that we're going to use today. The financial materiality is whatever is happening out there in the world, so the policies that we're looking at, all of these different regulations, how they impact the business. So really, ESG is a risk management tool. And we first heard about ESG in reference to responsible investing, sustainable investing, whatever you want to call it. So we can look at that as sort of outside-in impacts. How the rest of the world is affecting our business. Why does that matter? Because everything right now in the US is voluntary, which means that anything that is happening that impacts our financials is not being regulated yet. There's no fines, there's no accountability. So what did people do before this? Well, they looked at impact materiality. What is material outside of our company that we can impact? So if you want to look at that as your inside-out impacts, that kind of used to be called sustainability, CSR, triple bottom line. That's your voluntary reporting. So how many companies here do some sort of CSR, corporate social responsibility, report, not including anything that might be in a proxy statement or a 10K, a voluntary corporate social responsibility or sustainability report? That's not a lot, and I see some half hands, so I don't know what that means. That's like the 2-pager, I guess, or the communications on the website saying like, come back later. All right, no, I appreciate the honesty. So that's important. Right? So 90% of S&P 500 companies now voluntarily disclose some sort of ESG or sustainability report. That's really, really big because we're not even regulated in this country yet for any of these things. There's some stuff coming up, which I'm sure you probably already know a few of the policies and regulations that I'm going to be talking about. That was not me, but that works. So we want to talk about how this kind of thing impacts businesses. And what's funny, if you think about it, I want to go back to the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. Now somehow we decided that we don't want to talk about profit anymore and we just put governance in there instead, and now we call it ESG. But somehow someone decided that if you put profit in there, that we're not allowed to acknowledge that companies want this to be profitable. And I get it. I was in sustainability. I wanted people to do it for the right reasons. But it does need to be profitable. And so when we're looking about how this stuff impacts our business, it's twofold. Number one, it impacts our businesses from a risk management perspective, because we need to look at things like energy prices and volatility. We need to look at policies and regulations, fines. But we also just want it to be profitable, sometimes just for the sake of profitability, and that's okay. So what is the easiest way to make this kind of thing profitable outside of sort of the risk management arena? So I'm going to go back to what I know best. My specialty within the sustainability arena was energy management. And I love it so much. And one of the reasons is because when you look at governance and you look at the social pillars, those are really, really hard to quantify. Really important, but really hard to quantify. So what happens when we start looking at the environmental aspects? We start being able to quantify them. Why? Because we measure them in units. We can measure electricity in kilowatt hours, quantifiable. We can measure emissions and carbon dioxide equivalent, quantifiable. These are great ways to actually be able to track progress and hold companies accountable. So we're looking at a lot more transparency, a lot more scrutiny, But also, this allows companies to track things like return on investment for, let's say, a building upgrade. So since you guys have been so great with the questions, I'm gonna do another one. So how many people in this room, in some way, shape, or form, could be office, could be manufacturing facility, could be a storefront, could be a data center, but has at least one building associated with your business? At least one building. Does anyone not have any buildings associated with their business? Okay. Just checking. Why is this important? Well, number one, the statistic that maybe a lot of people have heard is that 40% of global energy comes from buildings, real estate. About 70% of that comes from operational costs. About 30% is what we call the building envelopes. That's embodied carbon. That's what's in the building materials. Why is this important? We're going to focus on the operational portion. Because when you bring operational costs down, you're reducing electricity costs. Quite literally, the utility bill that you get every month goes down for that building. So when we talk about profitability, we look at smart grid, we look at energy management. What are we looking at? HVAC systems, heating, cooling, air circulation, smart lighting. These are all things that if we use these, let's say you want to retrofit a building with some Energy Star appliances or a more efficient chiller, what happens? Energy consumption goes down. What does that mean? Operational costs go down. That means your utility bill goes down. That's a good ROI. That is quantifiable and trackable. So for no other reason, if you have a building in your business and you're looking at ESG, that is a great place to start. And it's not that governance and social isn't important. They are equally as important. But the reason why I love the environmental and the energy stuff so much is because it's so easily quantifiable, and it's also really fun. You can get really innovative with these kind of things. So we talked a little bit, I know Ray mentioned a few things that are going on. I actually live in Florida, so I am so sorry on behalf of the state of Florida. I actually grew up in Canada, so you're welcome for that, but I am sorry about Florida. So what are some things, and I'm sure some of you have heard about this, but let's just go through them again and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So some things that we've been looking at lately. SEC stalls the final climate disclosure rule. I'm thrilled about that. I think this is the second time they did it. Anyone here in audit? SOX reporting, anyone? I didn't know what SOX reporting was before I worked for a CPA firm, I'm not gonna lie. But when the SEC came out with that rule, they had about 200 comments. The SEC's climate disclosure rule had 14,000. Really let that sink in for a second. So I'm gonna give them a pass that they had to keep pushing this back, that's fine, and there are other reasons, trying to line up with some European regulations, and that's okay. But this is really something that you wanna look at. If they postpone this again, you're gonna see me coming up here and I might not be smiling, but it's okay. For now, we're good. 14,000. So what are some of the things that people were looking at? Scope 3 emissions is a big one. So scope 3 emissions, you're looking at your supply chain, value chain, whatever one you wanna call it. So if I asked folks in this room to define scope 1 and 2 emissions, who would be able to tell me what scope 1 and 2 emissions are? Okay, that's good. All right. I didn't want to tell you something you already knew. So scope 1 emissions, really, really easy, are your direct emissions on site. So it could come from vehicles, it can come from something on site. So if you could somehow put dye into whatever chemical was in, let's say a little portable cooling system, AC unit. If that goes straight from the appliance into the air, that's direct emissions, easy peasy. I mean, it's not that easy to measure. You would literally have to go around with the little machine and measure leaks, which is why not a lot of people do it. Scope 2, easy peasy electricity consumption, anything on your utility bill. So when we talk about reducing operational costs, a lot of that comes from scope 2 emissions. So you call it indirect, but really it's your electricity bill. Scope 3 is pretty much everything else. So what happens? Here's a great example. And when you go back to ESG and you kind of realize that there are some tipping points that happen throughout the past 10, 15, 20 years, one of these tipping points in the social arena, which I love, the Nike sweatshop scandal. Absolutely great example of a really big social issue that ended up being a tipping point, that ended up being a really big risk management lesson. And we talk about that because what happened? So long story short is that someone basically audited a sweatshop in Indonesia and said, by the way, you've child labor. And what did Nike say? Not me, not my business, not my site, never been there, not my problem. And customers went back and said, actually, it is your problem. It's your supply chain. And Nike fixed it. That's how important supply chain is, because you cannot say that you don't affect your supply chain. It's simply not true. And those bigger public companies, all of their goals are now trickling down the supply chain, and those smaller companies that used to say, you know what, it's probably not gonna come to me. Maybe in 5 years from now. Oh, you know what, even though the SEC's climate rule is coming out, that's still not me. It's for bigger public companies, it's coming. Whether you like it or not, it's coming. And so we go back to kind of the sustainability and ESG, sustainability, CSR, we can kind of call it more voluntary, ESG, those financial disclosures, that's happening whether you like it or not. And there are companies, ISS is a great example, they will rate you on your publicly available information whether or not you ask them to. You're gonna get a rating, it is publicly available, and you're gonna see that big ol' D or F, and the whole world can see it whether or not you wanted it to be out there. So if you don't have a social responsibility report, if nothing's in your proxy statement, if nothing's on your website about ESG, there are organizations now that will pull that sort of information from your business, and you're gonna get dinged on that, and that's not what we want. Inflation Reduction Act, IRA for short. Nearly $370 billion poured into clean energy. I love this. Carbon capture and storage is in there too. Do we have real estate folks in here? Commercial or residential buildings? No, okay. So the big ones, 45L and 179D, we won't get into then because that's real estate, but that's basically commercial buildings and residential buildings, and that kind of goes back into the energy efficiency portion. ITC, PTC, that's renewable energy. So that's the investment tax credit and the production tax credit for things like solar and geothermal. So what happens? The entire IRA is, first of all, it's a misnomer, right? Because it's not really much to do with inflation, but we're gonna let that one slide because all of these provisions are things that personally in energy management, I fought really, really hard to get extended and they never were. Started out at 30%, it started rolling back a little bit, 26%, 23%, 15, 10, and then it was about to be gone. So the Inflation Reduction Act extended a lot of these. EU just approved a new sustainability directive. They already had one. They already had the CSRD, hope I got that acronym right. Now they have a new one. And it's coming. So it's not just EU companies. So that's why this is important. It is supposed to affect at least 4,000. I think another number I saw was about 10,000 US companies. And also, you know, part of the reason why they're stalling the SEC, they kind of want to look at what's happening in Europe or in the EU. So these are just a few things that you can look at. Some trends to watch. Oh, goodness. Offsets. So I want to talk about in the news again. I think it was about a week ago, Delta Airlines is under fire. They are facing a class action lawsuit. Why? What happened? Well, they said they're carbon neutral. They had a carbon neutrality claim, and what happened? Turns out may or may not be based on some invalid carbon offsets. So what are carbon offsets? If I asked you, does anyone in this room know what carbon offsets are? Sort of. Okay, all right, not bad. Basically, it says I'm going to emit something over here. I'm going to put some really dirty carbon emissions into the air over here. I'm going to keep polluting. I'm going to keep my operations running the way they are. And then I'm going to buy some land, a project halfway across the world. I'm going to plant some trees, and it's going to offset my carbon. So are you taking carbon out of the atmosphere? Are you putting less? The idea is we don't know. So it's balancing it out, it's neutralizing your carbon, but you're still emitting, that company is still emitting these harmful pollutants into the air. That's not good. What we want to do is take it out. Whether it's carbon capture or storage, or whether it's energy efficiency and we're reducing that through operational costs, or if we're just covering it all by clean energy, these are all ways to reduce our carbon footprint without using offsets. So right now, we call it greenwashing, right? It's just kind of something you're not supposed to do. You really shouldn't say you're doing something if you're not really doing it. But when the SEC's climate disclosure rule comes out, that's now fraud. Right? Really let that sink in. You say greenwashing, we made up a term, it's cute. No. This is serious. And organizations are getting fined. And this is why we really want to look at the SEC's climate rules. So definitely keep an eye on that. Carbon offsets. Carbon offsets, to me, is basically like eating a bunch of processed food and then eating a salad for lunch and then wondering why you're not healthier, right? It doesn't cancel each other out. That's not really how that works. So that's kind of how offsets are. It's fine. I'm really happy you ate the salad. That's great. But it doesn't really cancel out all the ice cream and cookies. It just doesn't work like that. So cracking down on greenwashing, that's a big one. Management of human capital. So I didn't really focus on it because, again, my background's in sustainability, environmental management, but let's not neglect the social aspect of all of this, right? We're looking at DE&I, employee compensation, all of that stuff. That is going to be a huge trend coming up, and I think some folks are talking about it a little more today, so do another dive into that. All right, so where do we go from here? What can we actually do about all this with all of this information? So here's a great place to start. Number one, manage your physical and transition risks. So these are specifically for climate risks. So what does that mean? Two big categories, physical and transition. We're looking at climate risks, okay? Physical, super easy. It's usually related to extreme weather events, floods, drought, fire. Talking about buildings, everyone has a building somewhere. And that building is subject to weather. So whether that's wear and tear and you need to look at maintenance, whether there's a flood or a fire and you need to look at insurance premiums getting hiked up, or you really just want to protect your buildings. So anything to do with extreme weather events that are related to climate change are going to be your physical risks. You need to manage those. Flip side is your transition risks. We talked a lot about policies, regulations, anything to do with policies and regulations towards a global decarbonized economy is going to be your transition risk. So that transition towards decarbonization, you need to look at both of those things. That's another kind of two sides of the same coin ordeal. Sustainability-linked bonds and loans. Has anyone here ever done a green bond or sustainability-linked loan? Nobody. Oh, you're missing out. Is that a half hand? Is that half hand? No, maybe. All right. So this is great. This is a really great way to do it. You can replace a green bond with a regular bond when it expires, and I'm not really going to get into that because that is not my area of expertise. And I'm going to say something silly, so I will not go there. But the great thing about, you got green bonds and sustainability-linked loans. if you're getting a green bond, that actually has to go towards some sort of green project. That's kind of really hard. We get that. Sustainability-linked loans are great because your KPIs have to be ESG related. They can be in the social category or the environmental category. So let's say reducing emissions by, certain number of carbon dioxide equivalent. So there's your KPI. But that money can go towards anything in your company. So you get to address the ESG issues, and you can also put that money anywhere else in the company. Automation. So I keep talking about buildings because I love energy management. There's a lot of things that we can automate here. So right now, if we're walking around, these are definitely not sensored lights, but there's some really fun stuff that we can do in buildings with automation, right? We can do building management systems. We can automatically collect our utility data. We can automatically do data analytics. We can automatically do measurement and verification, which basically means taking a baseline of all of our energy consumption and then remeasuring it every year. And we can actually see how much we're saving from that baseline. It's really, really great things that we can do with automation. Provide quality assurance, no greenwashing. Keep coming back to this. And this is a great place to wrap up, not only because I have less than 5 minutes left, but also because if you need a quality assurance partner, who's really great at quality assurance? CPA firms. Just a little plug. That's all. So I'm going to wrap up with that, and I think that we might have a few questions, potentially.
I have a few. Am I on? Yeah. I have a few questions. So we now know that people understand what your degree is in. Your management now understands, hopefully, what ESG is in. But when you talk to a corporate leader, to a board, how do you get them to buy in? What's the pitch?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not save the polar bears. I will say that. Unfortunately. The hole in the ozone layer, I think, is taken care of, so not that either. But that's a great question because, first and foremost, you made the assumption that there is leadership buy-in, which if there's not leadership buy-in, you got to address that first. It can't just come from stakeholders and investors. You really do need that leadership buy-in. So a really great place to start. If you think back to that first slide, there was maybe 20 or 30 different things on that slide. You don't want to, nor do you have to address all of those things. Right, so how do you cut that down and really make sure what to focus on? We've already heard this term, materiality assessment. You can do a materiality assessment for ESG also to make sure that you're only focusing on the things that your company needs to focus on and that you get credit for the things that you're already doing. So take an inventory of things that you're already doing. Really great place to start. Current state assessment, inventory, materiality assessment to make sure that you're only focusing on the things that you need to and you're not biting off more than you can chew because we really do want success here. Leadership buy-in, if you've already got that, great. If you don't, you need it. You need some champions too. Absolutely need some champions. And then start looking at potentially things like greenhouse gas inventory because that SEC climate rule is coming up. And then just cross-functional collaboration. We can't do this in a silo. We need a team.
So, I think obviously the Fortune 500, the publicly traded companies, they all understand, this topic. They all have people like you on their staffs. They have sustainability officers, et cetera. Below that level, when we're talking about the smaller to mid-sized companies who now have to deal with the supply chain issues and everything else, how do they learn what they need to do? How do they get, other than coming to this conference, which they all should be here or should be watching, hopefully online. How do those smaller companies get educated about what their obligations or their best practices should be?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So stay informed, first of all. You can ask. So if anywhere in your supply chain, whether it's a partner, vendor, supplier, make sure that you look at what their goals are, because that's going to kind of start to trickle down. So that's a big one. Collaboration, always. I want to keep going back to that. Cross-functional teams. Hire a partner. Get advice. Get consultants on board. Upskill current employees. You can do, I've seen questionnaires go out, but really just collaborate with those companies and make sure that you know all of those, the goals that kind of those larger companies are looking at as well, because that's trickling down for sure.
Well, I think we're down to 35 seconds, so
That's pretty
I'm not going to
good.
ask you another question.
No, that's pretty
But I
good.
want to thank you for an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.